Back in the early 1900s, around 1912, there was a comic strip character named Caspar Milquetoast, Milquetoast. He was created by a fellow named H.T. Webster for his cartoon series called The Timid Soul. Webster described Caspar Milquetoast as the man who speaks softly and gets hit with a big stick. The character's name is derived from a bland and fairly inoffensive food called milk toast, spelled the right way, Milktoast, which is light and easy to digest and is appropriate food for someone with a weak or nervous stomach. Because of the popularity of Webster's character, who was of course always easily intimidated and never wanting anybody to really notice him. The term milk toast, spelled Milquetoast, came into general usage in American English to mean weak and ineffectual. When the term is used to describe a person, it typically describes somebody of an unusually meek, bland, soft, or submissive nature who is easily overlooked, written off, and who may also appear overly sensitive, timid, indecisive, or cowardly. Milquetoast often appears in American English dictionaries, but not always in other English dictionaries. Caspar Milquetoast was sort of the popular way to look at what the meek are all about. Our next fruit of the Spirit is meekness or gentleness. If you have the King James, it uses the word meekness. If you have a more modern translation, it uses the word gentle or gentleness. Defining meekness is something that's important in order to understand what we're talking about. In the Hebrew, it means, lacking. Lacking means it's used of the afflicted, the humble, the gentle, the soft. It's often used of the poor. And of course, you can understand why some societies don't want to be considered meek, especially if it describes the poor. They're the ones getting taken advantage of all the time. In Greek, the word actually means not overly impressed by one's self-importance. There were some Greek philosophers who liked that because they figured it provided a good balance in an individual. It also, means docile, mildness, gentle. And we'll look at the English in just a minute, but there's a passage in Romans 12, or a verse in Romans 12, where Paul doesn't use it, but I think that he actually defines meekness biblically. And he says, Romans chapter 12, verse 3, "For through the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think more highly of himself than he ought to think, but to think with sound judgment as God has allotted to each a measure of faith." I think that perfectly defines the idea of meekness. And of course, even though Paul doesn't use it, he goes on and talks about how we interact with the body. And I think that there's, as I'll talk about in just a minute, there's kind of two ideas behind this idea of meekness. That is, properly balancing ourselves, and that is, one, we're submissive to God, and one, that we behave properly in terms of our relationship with others. I think that Paul here, as he talks about the body in Romans 12 and then later on in 1 Corinthians 12, he says, hey, we all contribute equally. I don't raise myself up and think I'm more important, and I don't put people down. And so I think of myself properly and in balance. It's a virtue to have that. Now, when you go to English dictionaries, or American English dictionaries today, surprisingly, they say showing patience and humility, which is a good thing, enduring injury with patience and without resentment. Now that's something that we don't always do. But they also, make it easily imposed on, submissive, compliant, To make meek means to soften, render mild, to make something pliant. Deficient in spirit and courage, not strong or violent. Low in rank, modesty in behavior. But the opposites are arrogant, conceited, haughty, lordly, and self-asserting. I've read where most of the Roman society, or at least the society at large, wasn't really impressed with meekness. It was something they associated with servitude and with servants. In the Roman society, you wanted to create a sense of honor and respect. And you don't get that by acting like a slave or a servant. You get that by actually overpowering others. Now, not in a overly violent sense of way. But in American society, we don't necessarily like the idea of meekness. We associate it with Caspar, milquetoast. I was reading this one fellow who said a friend of mine who was an entrepreneur was listening to a CD of a series of messages I had given on the Beatitudes. When he came to meekness, he told me he skipped over it. He wasn't interested in being meek. Like most Americans, he thought of the meek person as someone who is timid, spineless, unassertive, and easily dominated or intimidated. Some readers will recognize these traits, and here's where I got my idea, as exemplified in a cartoon character of bygone years, Caspar Milquetoast, who has been described as a man who speaks softly and gets hit with a big stick. Further on the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus talked about meekness, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. John Stott says, these meek people, Jesus added, shall inherit the earth. One would have expected the opposite. One would think that meek people get nowhere because everybody ignores them or else rides roughshod over them and tramples them underfoot. It is the tough, the overbearing who succeed in the struggle for existence. Weaklings go to the wall and don't accomplish much. But meekness is really a defining grace for us, produced by the Holy Spirit in our lives as a fruit. And it characterizes our response to God as submissiveness to all of his dealings with us and to his word. But meekness towards humans means bearing patiently with the hurtful actions of others and dealing kindly with their own failures. Sometimes we don't do that very well, do we? A fellow I was reading said, at our school carnival, our kids won 4 goldfish. Lucky us. So I went out Saturday morning to find an aquarium. The first few I priced ranged from 40 to 70. Then I spotted the one that I wanted in an aisle, a discarded 10-gallon display tank, complete with gravel and filter for a mere $5. Sold! But it was very, very dirty. But the savings made the 2 hours of cleanup worth it. Those 4 new fish looked great in their new home, at least for a day. But by Sunday, one of them had died. Too bad. 3 had remained. Monday morning revealed a second casualty, and by Monday night, a 3rd goldfish had gone belly up. So we called in an expert, a member of our church who had a 30-gallon tank. It didn't take him long to discover the problem. I had washed the tank with soap, an absolute no-no. My uninformed efforts had destroyed the very lives I was trying to protect. Sometimes in our zeal to clean up our own lives, or the lives of others, we unfortunately use killer soaps, condemnation, criticism, nagging, fits of temper. We think we're doing right, but our harsh, self-righteous treatment is more than they can bear. You see, the meek person not only believes that they're submissive to God, but that they're helpful to others. And they have to be careful about how they're helpful to others. They have to make sure that they are that way properly. But I want to present 2 examples of meekness that will help us to see maybe them in their proper context. The first one is Moses, Numbers chapter 12. I'll find it here in a minute. It says in verse 3, now the man Moses was very humble, very meek in the King James, more than any man who is on the face of the earth. Moses is the meekest man in all the earth. Moses. Now, let's stop and think about Moses here for just a few minutes. Well, first of all, he was born, and his mom floated him down in a basket, also called an ark. Pharaoh's daughter found him and brought him into her household. Although Moses' mom ended up being his nurse, and I'm sure that she, while he was younger, told him who he really was. But anyway, for 40 years he was Pharaoh's grandson, the son of Pharaoh's daughter. And you remember one day he goes out to kind of see what was going on, and he saw an Egyptian guard beating a Hebrew. And so Moses kind of looked around, saw nobody was watching, and then he killed the Egyptian guard and buried him. Now, I don't know if you really thought about that, but Moses must have been a pretty tough guy and must have been pretty physical himself, because I'm sure that guard wasn't put there because he was some namsy-pamsy guy. I'm sure he didn't get the job just because, he had the right connections. I'm pretty sure he was a tough guy and probably was himself pretty physical. And yet here's Moses doing that. But here's Moses lashing out at this fellow. Uncontrolled. Well, Pharaoh wants to kill him when he finds out, after it becomes known. And so Moses runs away, and he spends 40 years tending sheep out in Midian instead of Pharaoh's palace. Now, I'm sure that must have been a humbling time. For 40 years now, he's out in the middle of who knows where, and who knows what it was like, instead of all the luxuries he had back then. And then, of course, God, God calls him through the burning bush. And so now Moses is told to go back to free the Israelites and just talk to Pharaoh. But Moses said, wait a second. I'm not, I'm slow of speech and I'm not all that good of a talker. And of course, God gets mad at him and says, well, just to show you, I'll give you your brother Aaron. He's a good speaker. But ultimately, though, God convinces Moses to be submissive and go to Pharaoh. Now, I don't know what that would be like. Maybe when when this is all over, we can sit around and talk with Moses. I hope that, that God does things like that. Rather, I've always had this vision that we just float around and sing for an eternity. I hope instead that my new vision is that God allows us to talk with each other and to kind of find out things about, about life on the earth. But that's Bob's vision of the future, not maybe anybody else's. But anyway, so he goes, and the 10 plagues come along, and I'm sure it must have been frustrating for Moses to constantly go to Pharaoh, to watch Pharaoh brought almost to his knees and then get back up again and saying, no way are you guys leaving. And then finally they leave. And Moses takes Israel out. And I wonder what Moses felt like. Wow, we're free. And they go off. And he takes them out. And as soon as they get out, they're not happy. First of all, hey, we're running out of food. Hey, we don't have water to drink. Hey, we want meat, not this manna stuff. Hey, we want to go back. Are we going to die here? Are we there yet? And then in chapter 12, where we read about this idea that where God says that Moses was the most meek man on all the earth, what we have is his own siblings, his older brother and his older sister, saying, hey, hasn't God spoken through us as well? What makes you so special? And so now they're treating him like the younger brother, the spoiled one. Well, he really wasn't. I mean, they weren't raised together, but you know how it is. And so they cast aspersions on him. And of course, God, has this, his anger, first of all, speaks to them and says, hey, listen, there's no other prophet like Moses, and I speak to him face to face. Everybody else, I speak in dreams and visions and so forth. But Moses, we talk face to face. And then, of course, Miriam turned leprous. And Aaron then begged Moses to make it stop, and God did. And so this was, to show the fact that that God had chosen Moses, and they weren't to question that. It wasn't Moses's. Moses didn't seize this place by himself. God gave it to him. And Moses didn't want it in the first. And so I'm wondering if throughout all of this, Moses is wondering, why do I have to put up with this? But you see what he endured constantly. There's there's constant criticism from Israel. There's constant criticism there's constant threats from enemies around them. And yet he remained submissive to God and always intervened on Israel's behalf when God threatened to destroy them. Every time, Moses gets down on his knees and say, hey, don't do this. Now, I'm pretty sure that, that, first of all, that God's anger was real. I don't doubt that. And that probably emotionally, that's what God wanted to do, was to destroy them and get back. But it always helped Moses, though, remember his place in God's scheme of things, that he was Israel's mediator. And so he got down on his knees and mediated just like he was supposed to. And so Moses shows us this great example of meekness. He is submissive to God, and he always intervenes on Israel's behalf, in spite of the fact that they injure him emotionally and mentally every day. It probably, I wonder if Moses got up every day and said, okay, what's going to happen today? All right, what new criticism are we going to go through? Now, the other example, obviously, is Jesus. In Matthew chapter 11, probably a passage most people know well. But before we get to the passage that people know well, there's a prayer by Jesus to the Father. We see these a lot. This almost sounds like it belongs in the Gospel of John. But anyway, at that time, Jesus says, I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, that you have hidden these things from the wise and the intelligent and have revealed them to infants. Yes, Father, for this way was well-pleasing in your sight. All things have been handed over to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father, nor does anyone know the Father except the Son, and anyone whom the Son wills to reveal him. Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle, meek, and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Now, stop and think about Jesus. He left a palace, heaven, and came down to humble circumstances of the earth. He left as the Son of God, the Trinity, and gave up, that form in order to take on the form of a servant. It's kind of like, a king of a country, voluntarily giving up his throne for a period of time to go down and live among the people without anybody knowing that he's the king, and so that he can see, what it's like. And that's pretty much what Jesus did. And that's kind of like what Moses did as well. He would endure constant criticism from the leaders, the scribes, who are the teachers of the law, the Pharisees, who are the ones who try to help the average Israelites stay disconnected from the Gentiles around them, and the Sadducees, who are the chief priests and the kind of the rulers. The very ones, though, who should have accepted him and welcomed him are the very ones who constantly criticized him. From the very beginning, it seemed like there was nobody on his side from them, although we do find in the Gospel of John that there was somebody from the Pharisees on his side. He would endure his family thinking that he was a loony. And, John chapter 7, his brothers sort of chided him, hey, why don't you go show yourself at, during this festival? the Feast of Booths. And I just kind of get the idea that the brothers, well, they didn't believe in him at the time, and so they didn't accept him. And so there's his own family kind of thinking, that he's gone a little, nutso. He would endure disciples leaving him, in John chapter 6, after he says, you must eat my flesh and drink my blood. There were a lot of disciples that said, we're not really sure that, we've you've fed us and you've healed us, but we're not really sure that we want to do this. And so they left him. He would endure kind of the little faith of his own disciples. O ye of little faith was mostly aimed at his 12. They sometimes just did not get it, and I'm sure that he just wanted to go on occasion. And he would, of course, have to endure Judas's betrayal of him. Now, he knew from the very beginning that was going to happen. And that's exactly what did happen. But then he would have to endure the crowds turning on him when he's arrested and put forth. And the leaders are kind of ramping things up and trying to work them up into a frenzy. And so the crowds turn on him. And many of those people walked by him and mocked him and so forth when he was on the cross. He would have to endure Peter's denial of him. Yet through it all, he would remain submissive to the Father. I think that there in the Garden of Gethsemane there was the biggest temptation of all going on. I know that there's that movie, The Last Temptation, and they try to be a little, and I don't doubt that Jesus probably was tempted in ways that we've really not thought about. And I've never watched or read much about The Last Temptation of Christ, and it's possible that he had some of those feelings and thoughts and temptations. But I think in the Garden of Gethsemane, the biggest temptation was to toss it all aside and say, I give up, I'm going back home. But he remained submissive, Father, yet not my will, but your will, Father. And he didn't lash out at those who rejected him. And of course, the Gospel of John is the only one that records this, but then he has that conversation with Peter. Peter, do you love me? Yeah. Yes, Lord, I love you. Well, then feed my sheep. Peter, do you love me? And I wonder if he got a little bit louder. I know that we've been told that there's two different words for love there. Peter uses inferior. I'm pretty sure that's not the case. I think that it was more doing it 3 times in a row. And I think that there's also a connection between the word that Peter uses and something Jesus said earlier that most people don't realize in the Gospel of John. Actually, Peter is showing that, yes, I'm loyal to you in very deep ways. But anyway, Jesus, though, throughout all of this, in doing Peter, do you love me 3 times, it was because of his denial and it's his acceptance back in. Peter, yeah, I'm challenging you here, but I'm also commissioning you. I want you to go out and feed my sheep and tend them. And so that demonstrates that Jesus' meekness, his submission to God and his love for us will receive us regardless of our state or previous behavior. Look at accepting Peter after what Peter did. Look at Paul, the apostle. And so all of that, helps us to see that Jesus is meek like he wants us to be, and like the Spirit is trying to cultivate in us. And that means that he will receive us. We don't have to worry. The Spirit wants to cultivate gentleness and meekness in us. We may resist a lot, but we need to be submissive to God and his word and act in a gentle manner towards others. There was a karate instructor who said one night he was putting on a demonstration in an inner city gym in Philadelphia. He was walking back to his car in an alley when a young man, a punk, confronted him with a knife and demanded his wallet. As he stood there, sizing up this young man, his mind went through several plans of how he could disarm the guy, break his arm, or even kill him. He was thinking, this young man picked the wrong guy to try to rob. But then he realized that this kid was pretty scared. So instead of hurting him, he just assumed the fighting stance and yelled, "Hiya!" And then he turned and ran away to the other end of the alley. And when he turned around, the punk was gone. He had the strength and the skill to hurt that kid, yet he chose not to. I would like to see that, wouldn't you? That would be funny. Too often, I think, though, we try to take an aggressive stance towards people. Even as Christians, I think that when we go out and knock doors and so forth, we try to be bold, we try to be aggressive. But that doesn't always work either as we're trying to reach out. A more gentle approach might work out. There was a missionary who waited a year before speaking to the people he had come to evangelize in the Philippines. He simply did his work faithfully and kept in mind all the things about what it means to be meek and gentle and loving. And in time, the leaders told the people, go spend time with that man. He knows God. He waited and was gentle. He also respected the people and cared for them by teaching them how to read as well. He was a man of hope, and from that hope sprang faith and love. And it was his meekness, his gentleness, that actually drew people in. And so you see, we are called to be meek. The Spirit wants to cultivate that in us. And when we cooperate by being submissive to God and to His Word, and then by being gentle with others, not allowing their failures, not allowing their hurtful actions to create resentment in us, then we will find that the spirit of meekness is cultivated in us. Take care, and God bless.